My name is Shaun Rein. I'm the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, which I founded in 2005 in Shanghai, China. I think when you look at it, earlier this week, Xi Jinping, for the first time since 2018, met with many of China's leading entrepreneurs in a public symposium. He met with people like the founder of DeepSeek, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, as well as the founder of NEV Miracle BYD. Now, it's very important that Xi Jinping made a show to meet China's leading entrepreneurs, because one of the problems that's been happening in China in the last 4 years is a loss of animal spirits. There's been a loss amongst the wealthy 10% of China and their lack of optimism. There's been a real pessimism that's been flowing throughout the business community. Now, I've been in China for almost 30 years. I love China. It's been an economic miracle, but we have to be honest. The last 4 years have been a real rough time for China economically. Now, in my 30 years here, there have only been 2 times that I've been worried about China from a systemic financial threat. The first was in October of 2022. At the time, Chinese consumers weren't willing to go to a restaurant or go to a store because they were worried that they or their kids would be called a close contact of a close contact and be sent away to a Fangsang hospital for quarantine for 10 days. So at that period, the entire economy was locked down. No business was being done. Nobody was spending money. The second time that I was very worried about China's economy was in August of 2024. You saw that youth unemployment hit 18.8%, housing prices dropped about 30%, and there was a fear amongst Chinese consumers and Chinese businessmen about the geopolitics overhang between US and China. People were scared that Trump would win. People were scared that Biden or later Harris would win the presidency. So the entire economy in China crawled to a stop. And that's one of the reasons why I think you've seen such slow economic growth over the last 4 years. So it's very important for Xi Jinping, Li Qiang, Wang Huning, and the CPC's leadership to meet with China's great entrepreneurs earlier this week to show that China is supporting the private sector, that China supporting innovation and technology, and to put on a show that, you know what, China can beat crippling sanctions from the United States and still thrive economically. As we all saw with DeepSeek a couple weeks ago, that DeepSeek and Chinese companies are able to create AI that's as good, if not better, than what you have in the United States. And so having this meeting was a real show to say the government is supporting the private sector to overcome crippling American sanctions, which I consider to be immoral. I first came to China to study at Nankai University in Tianjin, China in 1997. And what I found on the ground, the reality, was completely different from what I read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And over the last 30 years, I found that a lot of US media outlets just aren't objective, just aren't nuanced when it comes to coverage with China. Now, part of that is because a lot of their journalists who cover China for a living don't speak Chinese. You have people like Gady Epstein, who was the China bureau chief for The Economist. He actually lived in China for 10 years. He doesn't speak the language. So you have people who I think are presenting a biased, misinformed narrative of China's rise. So it's very rare that I read Western journals. I like to say that you'll get dumber and learn less about China if you read The Economist or the New York Times. Now, there are some good Western publications that are pretty good. The Financial Times, I have a lot of respect for. I know most of their journalists over the last 20 years, and I find them to truly be wanting to understand China. South China Morning Post from Hong Kong has some decent journalists as well. They're not quite as in-depth or quite as good journalists, like in terms of storytelling, as the guys at the FT. And I think Caixin Media is very good. But I really don't read much of Western press to learn about China. I read the Western press to see what the Americans and the Europeans are thinking about China. If you really want to understand what's happening on the ground in China, obviously the best way is to travel throughout the country. You know, during COVID, I went to almost half of China's provinces. I went to Tibet twice. I went to Xinjiang twice, and I run a research firm. Now, obviously not everybody can do that. So how should you get information about China? First, go on to Xiaohongshu or Red Note or Red. This is one of the amazing new apps that has opened up in the last couple weeks in China, where now you have Americans and Chinese are able to communicate. And I think one of the things that Chinese are finding is America's not as good as they originally thought it was. But a lot of Americans are finding out China's not as bad as they thought it was. So there's a lot of information flow. I also like looking at apps like Douyin or TikTok, and you can see how everyday people live and how everyday people feel. But in terms of Chinese media, I actually look at Xinhua and People's Daily to sort of read between the lines. So for instance, if they say that Chinese youth employment has improved by 2% over the last month, you probably know that youth employment numbers are very high. So you sort of want to read the opposite of what they're saying and read between the lines. But the best way is to try to come here, visit China, see with your own eyes what's really happening on the ground. You might be surprised about how China is. I know I was when I came in 1997. I found in the Western press, they kept talking about how the Chinese people were oppressed by the Chinese government. I found that there was an electric optimism in the country. I found that people supported then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji's economic reforms, and they felt that the lives of their children would be better than the lives of their own. And that's what I saw on the ground in 1997. And truthfully, until 2017, 2018, China was the most optimistic country in the world. It was really exciting to see. Now that optimism, frankly, has dropped in the last couple of years because of some of the COVID policies that hampered business and also the US-China overhang. So I just recently released a book called The Split, Finding the Opportunities in China's Economy and the New World Order. And I divide China's population into two groups. The first is the 90%. This is the majority of Chinese. These are low-income, middle-class Chinese. The second group are the 10%. These are wealthy Chinese throughout the entire country. These are people living in tier 1 cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. These are the real movers and shakers of the country. Now, frankly, the 10% they've had their optimism really diminished over the last 4 or 5 years. They've also had their animal spirits dissipate. And this is a problem for China's economy because the 10% are the movers and shakers. And unfortunately, they haven't been moving and shaking in the last 4 or 5 years. They've stopped investing, they've stopped buying, they've put a lot of their money to capital outflows, which is why you've seen so much pressure on capital outflows to Singapore, why a lot of people were doing illegal things like buying Bitcoin, and why a lot of the wealthy 10% were immigrating and moving to countries like Singapore, Australia, Canada, and even the United States. The 10% were worried over the last 4 or 5 years for a couple of reasons. The first comes to geopolitics. The United States under Trump, but really especially under Biden, who doubled down on Trump's tariffs, was seen as trying to contain China's economic and political growth. There was a feeling that Biden was trying to destabilize China and try to potentially push for regime change and overthrow the CPC. When the Chinese got good at telecom, like Huawei, the Americans said that Huawei was a national security threat and slapped sanctions on them. When China got good at apps like Temu and Shine, the United States said forced labor, or they're breaking laws by selling things too cheap, so we have to get rid of the de minimis $800 law that allowed Chinese apps from selling into the United States tariff-free. When Chinese companies like TikTok started to take over social media, the Americans said this is a national security threat because TikTok is going to spy on your children. When the Chinese got good at cotton, you got to remember 20% of the world's cotton, arguably the best in the world, comes from Xinjiang province. The Americans said that there's genocide or forced labor taking place in Xinjiang. So there was a feeling amongst the 10% over the last 4 or 5 years that the United States would try to impoverish China. The way that the United States has impoverished North Korea, the way that the United States has impoverished Iran, the way that the United States has impoverished Cuba for generations. And there's a fear amongst the 10% wealthy in China that we're entering a 10, 20-year minimum Cold War where the United States would do whatever it can to oppress China. Now, I'm an American. I love the United States. I would love for Trump to fire Marco Rubio and name me next Secretary of State. I've long thought about moving back to the US and running for Senate. I'm a red-blooded American. I love the United States. But I think, frankly, what the United States has done to China under the Biden regime was wrong. It's morally wrong trying to impoverish 1.4 billion Chinese simply because China exists and is becoming a powerful country. In many ways, China's system over the last 40 years has helped the low and middle income Chinese better than the American system, where the Gini coefficient is getting wider and bigger. So I think there was a fear amongst the 10% that if they invested in a new company, they would get hit by sanctions. They would get hit by tariffs, and they wouldn't be able to grow. I'll give an example. In my book, The Split, I have a chapter on artificial intelligence. And I argue that China's AI is going to be as good or even surpass that of the United States. Now, this is very different from Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of Google. A couple years ago, he said that China was 10 years behind America on AI. Last year, he said China was 2 or 3 years behind. But have you seen with DeepSeek, China is as good, if not better, than American AI, and they're able to do it at a fraction of the price. But until DeepSeek arrived, there was a fear amongst the 10% that Chinese companies couldn't rise because America would try to hurt China no matter what. And that's what stopped a lot of Chinese from starting companies or investing in companies because they said there's no hope. They just want to see what the geopolitical winds would say. That's one part of it. The second part, frankly, and it's a little bit more sensitive, is that there was a fear in China that Xi Jinping and the CPC was anti-business or anti-wealthy people. And so a lot of Chinese and especially international investors were worried that China was becoming anti-business, especially with the Common Prosperity Drive. Now, my own view is different. I actually think the Common Prosperity Drive is good. How can Xi Jinping and the CPC say that they represent the people if they're not trying to get access to health care towards low-income and middle-income Chinese? So that's good. The crackdown was also good on Jack Ma and Alibaba and the whole tech sector because Tencent and Alibaba were basically becoming a duopoly. They were strangling and stifling innovation, fair competition, in China. Basically, if you were a startup, if you were an entrepreneur, you had to get money from Tencent or Alibaba. If you didn't, you would have been squashed by those two. So I actually think the government was right to crack down on them. And without that crackdown, you wouldn't have seen the rise of what I call little dragons. Companies like Pinduoduo, companies like ByteDance, the owner of Douyin and TikTok, or companies like Xiaomi, companies like DeepSeek. So the crackdown was good. But here's my one issue. I think the government didn't do a good enough job at communicating both within China, but especially internationally, the reason for the crackdown. It also cut too far to the bone. I think a lot of people thought that the crackdown was due to the party and Xi Jinping himself not liking Jack Ma and thinking that Jack Ma was a rival to the power of the CPC. Again, I don't think that was the reason for the crackdown. I think it was more about creating fair competition. But when you don't announce something, that's when rumors get spread everywhere. And so there was a lot of rumors that this was a political infight rather than something good for the Chinese population, which is why I think it was great that Xi Jinping himself met with Jack Ma earlier this week at the public symposium, because this was a signal. In many ways, this was kind of reminiscent of Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour when he said, we need to have the economy and private enterprise flow. So this meeting was critical to show the 10% in China that the government is supportive of private industry, and I hope that they'll make it clear that it's okay to try to be rich again. That while you want to protect the 90%, while you want common prosperity, at the same time you have to make sure that you don't destroy the animal spirits and you don't destroy the confidence and the optimism of the 10%. Because you can't achieve an end of poverty, you can't achieve a better quality of life for the 90% if the 10% aren't doing business, if the 10% are sending their money to Singapore, or if the 10% are holding all their capital into banks and saving their pennies. So this was incredibly important for the government to show the private sector and show international investors that China is open for business again.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。